The time for this debate has expired. I call on private and local order of the day number 1.
Christian Churches New Zealand Property Trust Board Empowering Bill Committee Stage.
I declare the House in committee for consideration of the Christian Churches New Zealand Property Trust Board Empowering Bill. Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Chairman.
Members, the House and Committee on the Christian Churches New Zealand Property Trust Board Empowering Bill. And the question is that the preamble stand part. The question is that preamble stand part. Those of that opinion will say aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. We now move to part 1, and this is debate on clauses 3 and 4. The question is that part 1 stand part.
Mr. Speaker.
Call Alfred Naro.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise and take a call on the Christian Churches New Zealand Property Trust Board Empowering Bill. I stand here on behalf of the Minister, the Honourable Nick Smith, who's not able to be here. Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, he sends his apologies. He's actually at a conference around freshwater, working with different iwis in consultation around this, Mr. Speaker. So I stand on his behalf in the chair during this committee stage just to bring the remarks. And Mr. Speaker, this bill has gone through the committee stages and through the committee. It was unanimous in its support, and we can see it's a bill that really just makes some minor technical changes, and in particular, I suppose in a sense, the responsibility of perpetuity for those Christian churches, which is a body of 30 different congregations throughout New Zealand, have been in existence since 1929, and their role in particular, Mr. Speaker, and for this bill, I suppose is the vestiture of assets from the association into the new trust board, which in effect will still allow them to be able to fulfil their roles of stewardship in this regard. So while each of the congregations are autonomous, they do have conferences which allow them to come together to discuss things of common, things of interest that are important to them, and especially their roles of responsibility in this regard, Mr. Speaker. And when we think about the roles of, in part 1, where it talks about, in clause 3, that the new board means the Christian Churches New Zealand Property Trust Board Incorporated will allow them to take on this role from the old board, which means the Associated Churches, Church Extension and Property Trust Board, Mr. Speaker. These properties are important. They're important because it does allow for these autonomous churches to be able to meet some of the needs, both spiritual but also practical. Mr. Speaker, having previously been a pastor of a church, a small local church that operated in that way, so whereas it was important to have a facility that could allow for the congregation to meet, to exercise its principled values of faith on a Sunday, but then also on the other days of Monday through to Friday and even Saturday, where churches like this, Mr. Speaker, will have things such as budgeting services in their properties. They'll have kindergartens that are in their properties, Mr. Speaker, and this is all to do with the property at hand and the use of that property, Mr. Speaker, which enables them to be able to exercise their roles of responsibility. And while the member over here may be talking about the weakness of this exercise, having actually been a pastor of a church, I know the importance of having such a facility and the roles of that facility that allows them to be able to do that, Mr. Speaker. So the bill is simple in its intent. However, it's important in its roles of responsibility, Mr. Speaker. So we believe that this is important. It'll allow the boards to be able to have those roles of responsibility in meeting those, Mr. Speaker. I know that there have been times in which there may have been common and small things, and maybe to the member who's interjecting over there, it may not mean much to her, but I have to say to those of those congregations, it means a lot. It means a lot because, Mr. Speaker, they can exercise some of those. So there may be small knitting groups, and I know that there were groups who used to knit for young mothers, whether it be little boots or whether it be little jackets and so forth. Mr. Speaker, those things are really important because the property provided a facility for them to be able to exercise this roles of responsibility, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, I think that it's important that we acknowledge the role that the board is playing, which again will still allow for the stewardship of these churches in their congregations for the exercise of this, for their properties as well, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there is also a sense that in the bill, in Part 1, it talks about the purpose, and the purpose is the transfer of all the existing property, interest, powers and obligations of the old board into the new board. And that technically becomes important. Mr. Speaker, I know that there are times that there are conflicts. People talk about politics in the House, like the politicking that's happening at the moment. But, Mr. Speaker, politics even happens in churches, where there's a disagreement about the property, the roles of the property, who should be in charge, Mr. Speaker. So opportunities like this become important, Mr. Chair, thank you to the member for correcting us. That was probably the most positive statement that the member has made during the speech, and I appreciate that from that member. So, Mr. Chair, I believe that it's important that this bill plays its role of responsibility.
Now,